Hello, welcome to the Math Together show where thoughtful math educators gather and learn together. I'm Molly Vokey.
I'm Dr. Sue Looney.
And I'm Heidi Subnani. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Sue, you want to get us started with what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure, I do. So our key question for today is to think about this idea of rough drafts in the math classroom. So we are super excited for our guest, Dr. Amanda Janson, is with us, and we're going to explore what that is and why and how math teachers would incorporate that into their math lesson.
Yes, we're super excited about our guest today.
Yes. So we thank you for joining us here this evening. We are really excited to be sharing this idea of rough draft thinking in the math classroom specifically with you. And if you're interested in speaking with one of us or getting some additional support after the show, you can always get a hold of us at looneymathconsulting.com. Additionally, we will be monitoring the comments during the live show and after. So if you have questions that maybe you think about something after the fact, you can always either write it in the comments right now or later, and we will try and get an answer either from us or from our guests this evening. So we would love for you to be part of the show in that way during this time.
Yay, excellent. So I'm going to get us started. I get to do the bio for Dr. Amanda Janson, who is a professor in the School of Education at the University of Delaware. Prior to earning her PhD in educational psychology at Michigan State University, she was a middle school mathematics teacher in Mesa, Arizona. Mandy conducts research on students' motivation and engagement, including how teachers can create more engaging mathematics instruction. At UD, she teaches future elementary and middle school teachers about content knowledge for teaching mathematics as well as pedagogy. So let's bring her in.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
We are so happy that you are here.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks so much.
Yes. So I'm going to get us started today. And this is often our favorite question where our listeners get to learn about our guest. And we feel very lucky to have met you. I don't know how many years ago we met. Did we meet you in San Antonio or Washington?
Probably I have a good memory of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Okay.
DSM.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
That was 2018.
Yeah. All right. So we would love for you to tell us, what is your why? Why do you do what you do? Why education?
So I'm really inspired by thinking about how we can create math classrooms to be a space where people can be their whole selves. And I often would relate to people's stories of math anxiety when I think about myself in a PE class. So I remember, right? I remember being in physical education, and then there were skills tests. And okay, in front of everyone, hit the volleyball over the net. And I couldn't. And then I failed in front of everybody. And so I would get really frustrated and nervous, and I didn't want to go to PE because that's where I was going to be embarrassed in front of everybody about everything I cannot do. And so when people would talk to me about their experiences with math and why they felt math anxious, it was often more about this performance space. I'm going to be incorrect in front of everybody, and that's going to feel bad. And I think both of these spaces don't have to be performance spaces. There could be spaces where we show up and this is what we can do today. And there's strengths in what we know and what we're able to do. And then we can keep building on those strengths together in community. And, I didn't go into physical education. I went into math education. But,
Right.
Spaces where students can show up in a classroom as they are, be seen for their strengths, and then we can keep growing in community together and learn from one another, basically.
So Mandy, I'm struck by that because I feel like for me, that kind of idea happened later on in my career. So when I first started teaching, I think I was like the perfectionist, the one who needs to know all things. And I had to really, be the center of the show. So did you start off your career kind of with this idea of, I don't know, morphing all the time?
So that's interesting because I think I had that idea for learning for the learner, but I think you're right. For myself as a teacher, I definitely thought about performing the epic perfect lesson and always being perfect with my teaching. And I think that that actually held me back as a teacher because my desire to keep things under control in these perfect little boxes didn't end up opening up the space for the learners because I was really focused on control and, being on time with my schedule exactly like I planned, right? And not being flexible to the students. So it's true that I had to grow and mature in my own thinking about myself and confidence and belief in my students. I wasn't able to act out of that space as much as I wanted to, but I knew I wanted to create a space where people felt free. But I myself had to grow into what that looked like as a teacher over time. That's a really good point. Yeah, I knew I didn't want people to feel like that, but what does it take to create that space is something that's taken decades to work on.
I was going to say the same thing. I feel like as I've grown as a person and aged, so that I've had to learn more of that. So, I mean, when you're younger, you don't have enough experience maybe to be able to see it. And maybe some people have more clarity when they're younger. I don't know.
Or like the option. I think maybe we don't often give permission in those spaces. So within classrooms, within, sometimes within family situations, it is that, okay, you have this role that you play and you find that role and fit into that role, and so that you can get through different environments. And so I think, I just need to figure out what the teacher wants. Kind of space versus actually what is my learning in this space and how do I have some input in that?
And I think for me it was this focus on being right versus being real. And I think that and I think as an early career teacher I was like, what does it take to be a good teacher? I want to be that. And what I have grown into more is that showing up and just being our most authentic self allows me to be more responsive, allows me to hear what people are really saying, listen to them rather than listening for what I think they're going to say, and just kind of being more authentic. It took more, time for me to become comfortable with who I am before I could really listen and really hear and be open to people. Shifting, right, from being the kind of teacher that I thought I should be to being more open to how the class together could be.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny how that happens over time, how we realize the more we know, the less we know, and the more we need to show up. But what you've been able to do is to take this journey of yours and turn it into an amazing research study that has recently led to the publication of your book on rough draft math, which we all have and are so excited about. And we're going to talk about, yes, there it is. Awesome. And we are we're going to talk about how people can find that book. I'll mention now that it is published by Stenhouse, so you can go to their website, which we'll put up for people later in the show. So it's amazing that you're able to take that question, that internal question of yours and that experience, and turn it into a researchable question that's resulted in something that we all can benefit from, and we're so grateful. So I think a place to start, if this is okay with you, is to start with the question here, like, so what is rough draft math? Like if you said rough draft English, we'd get it, rough draft essay, but what is rough draft math?
So the idea behind rough drafts in math class, what's very cool about this term, rough drafts, is that, like you said, we know what it is in other spaces. Our students will have heard it in language arts. So if you offer it to students, can you share your rough draft idea? They'll sort of already know without much of an explanation. Yes. Oh, you want me to just share and it doesn't have to be perfect and it's just the first thing that comes to my mind and maybe it doesn't even have to be done. Oh, you just want my draft. All right. And so that's a very liberating thing for people, that drafts are welcome. So rough drafts are, you're thinking at any stage. It doesn't have to be complete. It doesn't have to be correct. It doesn't have to be something you're sure about. whatever is on your mind that you're thinking about. And the idea comes from Doug Barnes. Douglas Barnes is a researcher who uses the term exploratory talk. We use talk to learn. We sort of talk to ourselves when we're trying to make sense out of something that we don't know how to do or that we don't understand yet. Every time we try to put something into words or in writing that we're trying to make sense out of, just the fact of putting something into a representation, we make a new connection in that moment. We develop new clarity by trying to represent an idea that we're working on. So we're using talk, we're using writing, we're using some sort of representation or drawing to keep learning through that communication. And so it's about, you're just trying to get your ideas out there. And so this idea came up because I was doing a study group with teachers in Delaware. They were secondary math teachers, middle school, high school teachers, and they all wanted to think together about improving classroom discourse. So we were reading about this idea of exploratory talk, this notion of using talk or writing to keep exploring. You're learning through the communication. And they thought, well, maybe it'll make more sense to kids if we call this rough draft talk. That way the students will have a better sense of, oh, I'm going to have to go through multiple revisions. So it's something that we're going to keep revising our thinking, because that's normal. When we are learning something new. We keep revising our ideas. The first idea that we put out there is going to have strengths to it, and then we can keep improving upon and build upon those strengths. So allowing revision in the math class as well is another part of rough drafts. So it's rooted in this notion of using talk to learn or writing to learn, to keep understanding through communicating. It's rooted in the idea of any way of thinking that we have now has some strengths that we can all learn from in community. And it's grounded in the notion of revising should be a part of what we intentionally and explicitly incorporate into the math classroom.
I think the connection to linguistics and how we learn through language, our thoughts and ideas have to process through language, but what you're talking about isn't written, just to clarify, necessarily.
It can be.
It can be written.
Thinking about talk first, yeah.
Exactly. Awesome. Well, let's unpack a little bit deeper around the how and why part of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, were you gonna?
No. I was just gonna lead into the question. So go right ahead. We'll jump right into it.
So, how and why a teacher might use a rough drafts in the math classroom. So as I said, this notion of rough drafts came out of the study group with teachers. I didn't go into the study group with an agenda of, hey, I have ideas of how to improve classroom discourse. No, I brought readings to the group, and we all read about how learning is a constructive process where you have to communicate and work in community to learn. And then we thought about what we could do to foster that. So every idea I have about how or why a teacher might use rough drafts came from the colleagues, the other teachers in the study group. And what was powerful is that people were able to achieve different goals under the umbrella of rough drafts. So one thing a teacher might do would be build a classroom culture where it's safe to share your ideas when they're in progress or unsure by tagging talk as a rough draft. Like, everybody just share your drafts. It's fine. Talking about how talking things through helps you learn, talking about how your first ideas are going to need to be revised, but they're going to have something of merit to them. Talking about how revising is normal, how no one should expect to have an ideal justification or explanation on their first try. Just talking really explicitly with students about all of that, setting up that classroom culture, maybe doing some number talks or other instructional routines, and then pointing out how everyone's drafts help the class learn more. So one thing that people do is use this idea to create that classroom culture as one of the components of building that culture that they hope for.
Well, I think that's such a critical piece of it, right? It makes, it forces the math class to look different than maybe what a lot of us experienced ourselves, and which was quick answers that were right the first time, versus that learning process. And so I think in particular in the math classroom, that for so long was the culture of how and who had access to the mathematics lessons, where in reality, that's not really what mathematicians do. There is a whole process that happens over time where you revise and change and grow and collaborate with other mathematicians. But that space has so rarely been the mathematics classroom. And so I think that's when I first heard you speak about this a number of years ago, that was so exciting to me, because I was like, oh, okay. Like it is, it's not just that first time. It gives us that space to think, to ponder, to speak without fear that it's not going to be correct the first time, or how I look at it I may need to adjust that as I go forward.
It's really trying to shift the math classroom from a culture of performance. Whoever's being called on is going to be either right or wrong, and we're all going to have an opinion about what they say, to a classroom culture where everyone is learning together and everyone has something to learn from what everyone has to say. So shifting away from this performance culture that a lot of us have experienced, right? So really just honoring that everyone's learning is always in progress, and the goal is find something that you can learn from what someone has to say, and that we're focusing on explanations over answers or justifications or different ways of making sense of the problem. That's really the point, not getting the answer quickly. So that's one of the things. So I think that there's two or three other reasons how or why. So one was the culture. Another underlying that is, like you were saying, Heidi, changing the classroom from one way to another. If we're not focusing on the answer primarily, we're focusing on the ideas. And so if you're using talk or writing to work on understanding, it really pushes on the goal of the mathematics itself. So the goal of learning is to try to understand more. You're trying to revise your thinking about something that you're trying to understand more and more, rather than it's not about solving the problem more quickly. So for some of us, when we think about rough drafts, we think about, well, what are we trying to revise? What are we trying to work toward? You could be trying to work toward having a more efficient procedural solution. That's one thing. But you could also be trying to work toward having a better justification for why something's true, or trying to work for a deeper understanding of why that procedure works. So one thing rough drafts can do is help people focus more on conceptual understanding in their instruction.
And so so part of it is that task, I think, that you would have to pick, right? And the purpose behind what that would be. And so then depending on that would kind of lead into how we are speaking about, or what our purpose is for that. If we're looking for one answer in one way, that's not going to be it either, as the one who sets it up in the classroom.
Yeah. So the first chapter in the book is all about what is rough draft, what does it even mean, and the theoretical underpinnings. The second chapter is different ways the teachers built the classroom culture. The third chapter is what you were saying, Heidi. It's about the tasks. So what about the tasks that we select offer up opportunities to keep understanding something more? So problems that could be solved in more than one way, or there could even maybe be problems that have more than one correct answer, and you have to think about the situation, maybe modeling problems where you have to keep revising the situation to get closer to that model that matches the situation. And then ways you could modify tasks that you have to make them more draft oriented, so there's more to explain and think about. Another reason you might want to incorporate drafts is that you want to build in revision opportunities for students to promote the idea that learning takes time. And so I'm going to give you lots of opportunities to continue to make sense. So it might be a revision experience in a lesson where they do a problem and then they come back to that problem later and keep revising it. There could be revision opportunities across a chapter or a unit. Do you incorporate revision into your assessments? What ways are you incorporating revising? Maybe you're using the stronger and clearer each time routine. but how are you acknowledging and allowing learning to be an ongoing process that takes time? And how are you explicitly introducing revision into your math teaching? And for me, this was the biggest revelation. When I started thinking about rough drafts with the teachers in the study group, I didn't even connect it to revision at first because I was so focused on this safe space thing. And it was my colleagues, the teachers in the study group, that were like, yeah, so we got to revise, right? We don't want to stay in the rough drafts. How are we going to build in revision? What are we going to do? So that became this gold mine to me of new learning for me. What are all the different ways that we can explicitly incorporate revision?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that the some of the parts that I've read, what I found valuable was that each teacher that you describe in here had, I know you already mentioned perhaps a different goal that they were trying to achieve by using rough draft thinking, but also it played out differently in their classroom, and not necessarily because they had a different goal, but the way that they did this was different than a way somebody else had approached it.
I think that is one of the aspects of this idea that I find really powerful, because rough draft is an idea. It's not a specific way to teach. It's a generative concept that people can use in different ways for different reasons. And so, for instance, another teacher was very invested in supporting students' identities. And so he was able to treat this notion of rough draft as a way to highlight that every student's thinking has strengths. And I can then say, well, your rough draft ideas are valued here. We can all learn from each other's drafts. And he was able to position more students as competent sense makers than he was able to do before. Someone would say, well, my draft idea is, so you're going to hear from kids you may not normally get to hear from because they're welcome to share their drafts. And if you're oriented towards everyone's thinking has strengths, you can point out, oh, this aspect of your idea or this question that you asked us, it's helping us all learn. And so more students can be identified as being helpful to the whole class in the spirit of complex instruction, where you can explicitly try to help their peers see the mathematical strengths in someone that they may not have realized had mathematical strengths. So it allowed some teachers to really highlight students' capabilities and develop more positive identities because of that orientation toward people's thinking.
It's truly a full circle, though, because the way that students are positioned with this idea of rough draft thinking is literally going from, I'm not going to speak because I'm afraid that I'm wrong, to I am definitely not sure about this, and so I am speaking now, right? So I'm going to ask my question because I don't know. And it's a total different feeling in the classroom, but a totally, completely different experience for students, like where you were in gym class feeling like every time you took a step, you would be making a mistake, right?
That's what it seems to be. I mean, this notion of, well, it's just your draft, it's okay, really opens up that space. Of course, that creates new challenges because as someone sharing their draft idea, maybe we don't all understand each other, but that's also an opportunity because we can keep asking each other questions to try to understand each other. And as you ask questions to try to understand each other, then somebody's thinking they might be able to clarify. When they clarify to answer the question, they clarify it for themselves too. So yeah, I think it does really open up that space, and it was kind of an intervention for me as a teacher. If challenge me, if I say your rough drafts are valuable, then I really have to live out of that space. And so then I have to welcome anything that everyone has to say. And then I have to make sure that we're all seeing the strengths in each other's thinking and living out of that. And so for me, it was great too, because I teach at the University of Delaware some math classes for future elementary teachers, as well as some teaching methods classes. And so then I got to try out the ideas too. So the secondary teachers would tell me what they would try, and then I would go try some of it with my own students. And I think these ideas are powerful, whether the students are in kindergarten or whether they're adults, because everyone wants to be put in a situation where their ideas are assumed to be valuable.
I did want to ask about that because I feel like a lot of the things that I read were with older students. So I'm wondering how it plays out in the younger classroom.
Yeah, so I think there's one example of like a 4th or 5th grade teacher, and then I've talked with teachers of younger grades as well. So an example, I believe I spoke with someone named Sarah McBride, and she taught 3rd grade at the time that we were talking. And she said that she used the notion of a rough draft around a vocabulary term. So she was introducing the concept of fractions to her class. And so she just said to her students, when you hear the word fractions, what do you think that a fraction is? And so she had a word wall, they put up fractions, and they defined it in some way, like, oh, you're splitting something into 2 parts or whatever. So she just accepted whatever draft definition they gave. Okay, this is our working definition today. And then they did some more work with fractions, and they realized, like, oh, fractions aren't just 2 parts, it could be all kinds of parts. So they split something up into multiple parts. Okay, so they revised their definition. Every so often, the students would be like, wait, we need to change this definition, as they kept working. And oh, the parts need to be of equal size. So then they revised their definition again, right? So taking a concept, accepting students' initial incoming ideas of it, and then letting the class keep coming up with a more precise or more illuminating or a definition more aligned with the discipline, but over time letting the students create that class definition. That's one way that this teacher used a collective revising process of students' drafts. So you can do that with any.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really like that you gave the example around vocabulary, because I feel like when we talk about language in the math classroom, I've seen examples where teachers want to give a math vocab quiz, and we have 2-column notes, and we talk about precision of language. It says that in our standards for math practice, but we have to arrive at that precision. We can't begin with the precise definition because it doesn't make sense to us. So I love that you gave that example, because that's a real shift for teachers to think about. So they hear that math language is critical, that we teach that, but what you just described was so beautiful about this generative process at arriving at this collective understanding of a term, instead of starting with like, here you go, here's your list, write the definitions, go memorize.
Right. I'm definitely a constructivist. People build up understanding through experience. And, like I said, this idea of this vocabulary came from the teacher that spoke with me, with Sarah, but it resonated with me, right? Like, let the kids construct the definition in ways that make sense to them as they experience fractions over time. And if we just hand somebody a technically correct written out vocabulary explanation that they can memorize and say back to you, it looks like they know, but they could be just repeating. And I would rather someone have an imperfect definition in their own words that makes sense to them, rather than a definition that looks like the textbook or the dictionary,
Yeah,
definitely.
I think that idea of coming back to, and I think it was after DC, I went back and tried in one of the schools that we were working with in a 3rd grade classroom. And it was that idea of unpacking a larger word problem. And I did bits and pieces of it at a time. It started off numberless and then went forward. The kids also, I'd given them a cartoon template, just like the boxes of, and so they were drawing out the cartoon and what happened to kind of get to an understanding of what operations they were going to use and how that progressed. And I had kids who kept going back and they're like, oh, this is like writing. And I was like, well, yes, like, but this is math class. It's like, well, we can do both. Like it helps me see your thinking. And when you add a new detail, how does that help you? Is that detail for me, or is that detail for you? And is it helping you make sense of what you're doing?
Through writing.
Through writing. And or through the picture that you're drawing. I said, well, why are you choosing to add text in this part? Like, so you've added a speech bubble. Why are we doing that versus just drawing it in a picture? But it was why we use those pieces and where those operations come in versus, you know, oh, I've plucked the numbers out and we're working on multiplication, so I'm just going to multiply.
I found the keywords or whatever.
Right. Yeah. And so I said, you know, that's this process. But it did take longer. We worked on one fairly large problem for the math class, but it was that idea of, they realized pretty quickly, okay, I can keep going back. Like, that's the whole purpose of this, is to keep going back and making revisions. So it doesn't matter if I tell you, I think I know what the answer is. Well, I don't care right now.
And I think what's powerful about these two examples, one is vocabulary and one is what's happening in a story problem. It really gets at this notion of what we want people to understand. So with the vocabulary term, it's the understanding of this concept, what's a fraction. And then in your example, Heidi, it's understanding the relationships between quantities in that problem, right? Like what are the relationships being explored? How do those quantities relate to each other? What's happening in this story? That's the thing you want them to understand. So when I'm asking people to revise, it's putting myself in the position of, what do I want people's understanding to get? What do I want someone to understand better? What is it that I want them to understand? It really pushes me to think about that goal for their learning. And I think that's right. Like, putting something in another representation, like a drawing, really helps them think about what's happening, how they're making sense out of the story. That's beautiful.
Yeah. And this was an inclusion classroom, and the child whose work progressed the most and ended up being the model was one who, according to the teacher that I was in that classroom, was language skills were an issue, and that was one of the reasons, but he could draw and explain and show in that way. And so it was all of those pieces. And so other students in that moment saw, like, the stick-to-itiveness that he had in that, and how he continued to go back and make sense of it. And he was an amazing artist. So like that, like they saw
builds on his strengths, right?
Yeah, it built on that. And so for him, it was a moment of, okay, like I'm in this class and I'm showing, and I'm the one who gets to share my thinking and show how, but it had changed over time as well. So everyone's thinking had changed over time. And so everyone had a part in that learning, but the representation that they liked best was one that was not always heard in the regular math lesson. And I think,
yeah, and that's kind of what I was saying before about being able to amplify and position students as having mathematical strengths that maybe their strengths wouldn't have been seen before. So I love that example.
Awesome.
I have another story about an elementary teacher.
Absolutely.
Would love to hear it.
Okay, so in the book, Eli Tinkelman, I think he teaches 4th or 5th grade, but he worked in Fairfax, Virginia. He had his students at the beginning of the lesson do a problem that they had enough prior knowledge to make some progress on, but it was still kind of new for them. So he gave them a problem and they worked on it. And then they had a lesson that was related to the ideas in that problem. And at the end of the lesson, they went back to take out your paper again of that problem you were working on. Use a different writing utensil, like maybe use your pencil at the beginning. Now use a marker, and then see what you can do now. And so the two different writing utensils allowed them to see their growth in their thinking, realize like, oh, I know more than I knew before, and they could revise that work and show themselves what they learned from that lesson. So I think that's something you can do with a lot of grades, but it worked in upper elementary school pretty well.
I love that part about this idea of revisions and rough draft thinking, because it really allows it allows the teacher too. I always used to feel that when I was teaching that, I was supposed to provide these experiences for kids, and it was kind of like a secret what they were supposed to be learning. Right? Like, oh, I'm going to develop your self-esteem, but I'm not going to tell you I'm doing that. Right. But now this is like just all open, and kids are discussing their learning. And they, if they started doing this when they were in kindergarten, they would know exactly what kind of learner they are by the time things get really much more difficult in middle school and high school when they're going from class to class and, things are changing for them. So I just feel like it's such a, not only is it good for the content, but it's just really good for the development of a person to learn about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think so, because there's something that happens in learning that when we understand something new, we sort of feel like we always knew it. Like, oh, I must have always thought this. You forget the journey,
Right,
the long journey that it took to get to that point. And if you document your revision and you think back, what did I think before and what do I think now? It helps you honor that learning is an ongoing process. And then maybe you'll get less frustrated when you're encountering another new idea because you've reflected back and you saw, oh, this was a long journey too. I may feel like this is a part of me. I understand this idea so much it's a part of me, but it took a long process to get there. So if I feel like I'm not sure right now and I'm overwhelmed, well, that's a normal thing. So if we incorporate revision explicitly and help students think about how their thinking is growing rather than how they're performing, how are your ideas growing? Then I hope it'll develop persistence among students and help them realize that challenges are what everyone faces all the time.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. Love it. All right.
So your brilliance doesn't stop there. You continue to be working on amazing things, and we'd like to just hear what the latest thing that you're working on is, and sort of where your time and energies are being spent right now.
So I have the opportunity of the last few years to work on a grant funded by the National Science Foundation between the University of Delaware and Arizona State University. And it's called the SMILES Project. And SMILES stands for Secondary Mathematics in the Moment Longitudinal Engagement Study. So we worked with students in 9th grade and followed them into 10th grade. And so that's the longitudinal piece. The in the moment piece is that we want to understand how high school teachers' instruction can be engaging for students. But sometimes when people study motivation, they survey kids and ask them how they usually feel, like if they're usually confident or if they usually find math interesting, like how they typically feel. But really motivation and engagement just depends on the moment, depends on the thing. We can all think about math classes where certain days we were into it and certain days we weren't. So we developed a survey that was more like in the moment. Right after an activity, we give the students an immediate survey, like how they participated and their level of interest and how confident they felt, or how they collaborated with their peers, things like that, immediately about that activity. And before we went in, we asked the teachers who are willing to work with us, we asked them to pick a day for us to come in, and they filled out a Google form to conjecture when in the lesson do you think will be the most engaging activity. So the survey can be also feedback for the teachers, but it also, increases the likelihood that we would, get engagement from students, because it's when the teachers are really trying to have the most engaging activities. So then we have been studying those activities where students reported high levels of engagement, and trying to see what's in common in the teaching in these high school classes in a couple of different states. So that's been fascinating, because it's very generous of teachers to invite us in, and we're very oriented to seeing strengths in teaching, just like we're oriented to seeing strengths in students' thinking. And then the students help us find where those strengths are by them telling us the kinds of activities that are engaging for them, and trying to identify instructional practices that are in common among those activities. So we have some emerging findings from that study, which are pretty exciting. And so we're starting to write about that more and more. So I can share a little bit about that if you want.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes.
Okay. So one instructional practice that seems to be very relevant for helping high school students feel more confident, it's this practice that when teachers are positioning students as having something to share, raising students' statuses, purposefully identifying when students are offering something that helps the whole class learn. When teachers do this regularly, like Heidi, what you shared about that connection, it helped us all make sense out of those things. Or Sue, when you asked that question, it really helped us all keep making sense. when they're identifying and naming specific strengths and attributing to specific students and then helping everybody see how those strengths help the class learn, more students in the entire class feel more confident. And that's, so they're reporting higher self-efficacy in classrooms where teachers are doing that. And that's so interesting because they might not be, their own personal strengths may not have been identified that day in that lesson. But I think it's more this spirit of knowing the teacher believes in us, right? The teacher is noticing people's strengths, and probably theirs some of the time too, right? So I think that we all believe that that practice is relevant and useful and supportive of students, but to see that it supported the majority of students' competence, their confidence, I think that's fascinating. So we're finding these different correlations between instructional practices and high levels of student engagement. So that's one that I feel like I can say with confidence. We're still doing a lot of data analysis, but that's a great one to have that kind of data behind it because it's hundreds of kids and hundreds of observations that we've had to study. So
it's a fantastic one. It's such a feel-good one, but also that's so easy for me to hear. Like I can do that now, right? So if we have data that says this particular instructional move, so when we identify and name the strength and we name the student, everybody develops more engagement,
more confidence,
and then we can teach and more confidence. Then we can pull everybody in. We can teach people, we can say, just do that. And we give everybody another tool. So that's super exciting.
Yeah, because we know about this instructional practice from complex instruction. Elizabeth Cohen and Rachel Lotan, even in the early 90s, were teaching us about this practice across content areas. And it's shown to have different kinds of impacts like leveling out status among students where students start to see each other as resources, but getting different kinds of data at the high school level. Their data was more with elementary, but also getting this connection to the confidence level of all students getting higher. I think that's interesting too. So It builds on prior research, but has a slightly different twist to the findings for the students.
Yeah,
so that's exciting.
Oh no, I was going to say, so interesting. And like, so we're in a virtual space, right?
Yeah.
And for most high schools, even like if we're trying to get kids back, it's often the younger kids. And so high school kids are virtual primarily, but that is one of those things. Okay. So if I make notice of, and I call and name how that particular insight or that question has helped the group, and thinking about what that could look like in a virtual space and how that might increase our feelings of confidence when we don't have that connection that we do even in the classroom, I think is something we can do. It's doable, and it I think could have an impact in a virtual space. It's not like I don't need something else other than to name that and to make the connection explicit.
Teachers in Delaware who value this practice then have been finding resources like Desmos, where you're able to see the students' responses through the electronic system, or like Jamboard or Google Slides, whatever they can use to get students thinking visible, right? Because to amplify and show that students thinking that can help us, we have to be able to access and share thinking. And so they're prioritizing tools that allow them to do that. Groups on Jamboard, then I can look at everybody's Jamboards and I can take a screenshot, or I can use Desmos snapshots and share. And you don't even have to do them all the same day. Like, oh, this came up this week, we can do a callback. You can, but having artifacts of student work that you can show and share. Oh, Flipgrids, and then you can take a clip of the Flipgrid video and splice it into your video and then talk about it. But it really puts us in this space of, well, how am I going to access thinking in this online space so then I can keep this practice up, right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so much good stuff here. So much good stuff. It's just such a pleasure to be able to talk to you and connect with you again for us, because, you know, we're not in Delaware too often, although I do go to Delaware every year, but not this year because of pandemic. So
where do you go?
We go down by Rehoboth Beach.
Yeah, Rehoboth. I love
Yeah.
that. I was in
Yeah.
Rehoboth over Labor Day.
Yay, fun. So thank you so much for being here with us. And if anybody would like to buy Rough Draft Math, you can buy it at this website, and I will put in the comments some more links to get in touch with Mandy if anybody is interested.
You can read chapter 1 for free. So if you go to stenhouse.com and you look for Rough Draft Math, it says preview this book. And so we have like the forward to the book that Robert Barry wrote and my chapter 1. And so you can read that and you can decide if you want to read the
That's great to know.
Yeah,
that's
you
fabulous.
do want to get the book as well.
Yeah,
and
the book is excellent.
Highly recommend. And so we so appreciate you being here and sharing your thinking and your research with us. And this has been something we've really been looking forward to.
Absolutely.
It's so great to spend time with you all.
All right.
All right,
Mandy,
take good care.
Thanks so much.
Thank
All right.
you.
And
All right. So let's wrap this up. That was a great interview.
so great. And it's so easy to connect with, so easy to implement. Heidi, like you said, it doesn't matter that we're in a hybrid space, and it almost just like brings everything down, like, oh my gosh, it's Rough Draft. Yeah. So this is a big win. So I'm excited. But
and in that revision process, I think going back, like, okay, so because things take longer in a virtual space too, right? So, okay, we're going to start it here. So we know this from the beginning. We're going to adjust and we're going to revise and we're going to think through these problems. So we're thinking not day by day planning, but we're looking at longer chunks of time. So I can come back to, I can revise, I can add to, I can take away from in order to make sense of a larger problem or a larger concept or idea, which I think is so needed in this space and in this time.
Sure.
And
100%.
then that high school engagement piece as well. It's so hard.
Definitely.
Schools are so hard sometimes, and in a virtual space in particular. So
right.
Yes. So we will be continuing this conversation ourselves. And if you want to get in on that and continue it, you can always find us at looneymath.com. Our Math Together learning community will be opening up again in the new year. And so we're going to continue this conversation in that space as well and be supporting teachers who are part of that community there. So we would love to either have a chat with you, one of our coffee chats, or touch base with you in another way. You can always find us there or on Twitter.
Yes. And next week, it's not going to be next week. And I changed that, but it didn't change. So our next show will not be until December 3rd. We hope that everybody next week will be enjoying their Thanksgivings. Even if they're not having their normal Thanksgiving, we hope that you are able to relax and enjoy. Teachers need that.
Yeah.
And so on December 3rd, we will be having Chrissy and Cora Newell here as our guests. And Cora is Chrissy's daughter. So we're super excited to have our first student on our show. So that is going to be very exciting. So thank you guys so much for being here with us tonight. And remember to always be curious.
Take care, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye-bye.